So we are continuing on our study from Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And then again, just a recap, so much of Matthew 5 through 7 from a Jewish perspective and from my research and my study and so forth is really the two chapters that lets me know, or is basically Messiah, Yeshua saying, I am the Messiah, and fulfilling many of the promises or the prophecies that he was said that he was to do, in part, and I say in part because we have Mashiach ben Yosef, the servant Messiah that comes, and then we'll have Mashiach ben David, the king Messiah, who will return and come back. And so we've covered some of the prophecies that he spoke of, because Moses said, a prophet like me will arise among you. And then he got into some of the heavy aspects of the Torah. And now he's essentially elaborating on Torah, which is what he's also supposed to do in a way. But keep in mind, as we studied last week from Deuteronomy 13, is not to add to or subtract from the Torah. And so how can he do this? And an elaboration is not necessarily adding to the Torah if we are understanding what and how we are supposed to do things, when from the Torah we get our essentially our why and some commands that may be a little bit ambiguous in nature. And so the rabbis throughout the years, whether it's through the Sanhedrin or through different rulings, they have come to elaborate on some of those rules as well. And depending on your level of halakha or observance, some would be more binding than others, but nonetheless, it gives you a way to understand or how to apply some of the commandments that we are given, especially in this week. A side note, as Greg was teaching on Mishpatim, we look at the laws of slavery within the Torah, and we sometimes forget there's two parts to it. One is an opportunity to be restored. Slavery in the Bible was an opportunity to be restored, as well as an opportunity to prevent you from getting so far in debt that you can never get out. Because if I was to go to Greg and say, Greg, I need a loan from you, Greg knows that whatever we are at in terms of the cycle of the Shemitah year, the 7 years, he's not going to loan me more than what I could pay back during that servitude. Because at the end of 7 years, as Ivri, the servant, as Ivri servant, I would he's got to let me free, and our debts are released at that point. So he's not going to lend to me more than what he's going to be able to get back. And then with even those of the nations after 50 years, depending on where they're at in the 50 years, they're let free within that same period. So it also served as a prevention of getting too far into debt, but also an opportunity that when you do get into debt, you fall into hard times, you have an opportunity to get out of debt and working it off, if you will, or a work release program, if you will, in terms of a servitude, slavery, if you will, where you have an opportunity to crawl out from underneath of that debt that you had, or the hard times that fell upon you. And so last week we finished up with 21 and 22 out of Matthew chapter 5. And I better get Sefaria.org. If you're not familiar with this website, it is a Jewish library of exponential proportions. The amount of information that is in here, and they keep adding to it. I don't want to say on a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis or monthly basis, it is a website that is constantly updating, adding text, whether it's in Hebrew, some of it's translated into English. So they're also doing work to translate some of the writings into English, but we'll be referring a number of subjects today in Sefaria. So Verse 23 and 24. So we were talking about do not murder, and we were talking about anger, harboring anger, and so forth, and how that was not contrary to rabbinic writings or to the rabbinic thought, and even today Jewish scholars would agree with his Messiah Yeshua's assessment here, saying that not to nurse anger. But then he goes on to 23, and he goes into the point of, so if you are offering your gift at the temple altar, and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there where it is by the altar, and go and make peace with your brother. Then come back and offer your gift. We'll stop there. And so as I'm thinking about this, I want to go to, let me open another tab here so we bounce around fairly quickly. I want to go to Leviticus chapter 5. In Leviticus chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, as a reference here. It helps if I spell it correctly. C and V too close today. All right, Leviticus chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 21 through 26. Now, if you're reading from a Christian canonized Bible, that's going to be chapter 6, starting in verse 2. If someone sins and acts perversely against Adonai by dealing falsely with his neighbor in regard to a deposit or security entrusted to him, by stealing from him, by extorting him, or by dealing falsely in regard to a lost object he has found, or by swearing to a lie, if a person commits any of these sins, then if he sinned and is guilty, he is to restore whatever it was he stole or obtained by extortion. And whatever was deposited with him, or the lost object which he found, or anything that which he has sworn falsely, he is to restore it in full, plus an additional 20% or 1/5. He must return it to the person who owns it on the day when he presents his guilt offering. He is to bring as his guilt offering to Adonai a ram without defect from the flock, or its equivalent according to your appraisal to the Cohen. It is a guilt offering. Thus the Cohen will make atonement for him before Adonai, and he will be forgiven in regard to whatever it was that he did that made him guilty. So if you noticed, what did he say? That he must give it back to him on the day that he presents his offering. So verse 24 or 6:5 says he is to restore it in full plus an additional 1/5. And so sometimes we stop and we calculate monetarily 1/5. That's super easy, right? 20% of a monetary is pretty easily for the most part. But if it comes to in particular an object that is being replaced, then that object is automatically upped by 1. So in the example that I've often that I'm known for is I mentioned that if I go and slash somebody's tires, 4 tires on their vehicle, well, Torah is telling me right here that I must replace the 4 tires, but I can't give you 1/5 of a fourth of 4 tires, right? And that's going to do you no good anyways, right? If I cut out a 1/5 of one, give you an incomplete tire, that's not going to help you in any way. But if, as we understand Torah, I add that 1, well, then I'm giving you also a good brand new spare tire as replacement for the sin that I did against you, the offense that I did against you. And Torah tells us that we are to do this before we even present the guilt offering before the Lord, because we have to restore or make things right between our fellow man before we can be restored with the things of Adonai. Sometimes this is contrary to some other teachings that are out there, but Torah is very specific. We must seek restitution with the person that we've caused the offense, especially when we know that we are guilty before we go to the Lord. This is no different than what Messiah is speaking in Matthew chapter 5. He's saying, leave that gift at where you are at the offer and go get right with your brother, resolve that conflict, and make sure that you have peace, because lest your sin that is with them harbor, or I shouldn't say harbor, but inhibits and prevents your prayer from being heard by him. We can see this elaboration. I know this is after Messiah speaking here, but I want to take a look at Romans chapter 12, verse 18. Oops, I used the wrong one. Switch that back up. Romans chapter 12. Bless you. In verse 18, Paul is telling us some things here. Oh, bouncing around. He's telling us, if possible, and to the extent that it depends on you, live in peace with all people. So Messiah is telling us, if we, even when we have someone that we have an offense with and we're bringing an offering to the Lord, we should stop, go make sure we are at peace with all people, and to the best of our ability. We're not seeking revenge, as Paul says later in verse 19, but we are instead, we're seeking peace and making sure there's no one that can accuse us before we bring this offering, therefore inhibiting any of the prayer that we are doing. And we'll see a little bit more of that as we continue in Matthew chapter 5. One other place I'd like to take a look at is Proverbs chapter 11. Looking at verse 10. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there is joy. And I bring this verse in to remind us that because we sometimes look at it as, oh, we've got to be martyrs or we've got to have these negative things. But Proverbs gives us a very different picture. It says, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices, because when the righteous, as we talked about before, when the Tzaddik is doing what they are called to do, walking and living at peace, not causing offenses, trying to walk with right justice and judgments and truth, and carrying it out with love, then the city rejoices because there is order. One of the things that's interesting about the history of Israel is that throughout much of the history, when they would be conquered by nations, the nations would look at them and say, they've already got a judicial system. They're already a civilized people. As long as they pay taxes, we'll leave them alone. And throughout history, that's been the case. So, and of course, along the way, somebody comes along and says, no, we don't really like the way that they're doing things. They should do things our way. And that usually creates conflict as a result. But many of the nations, whether it was the Greeks that first, took over when they conquered Israel, they sort of just left them alone. Messiah is saying, after you've made peace with your brother, okay, so peace, again, shalom in the Hebrew means more than absence of conflict. It means harmonious relationship. Sadly, the dictionary often just puts absence of conflict as the first thing for the word definition of peace, but I think it was in Merriam-Webster, it was about number 3 in the list of definitions that it said harmonious relationship. And I said, that should be number 1, in my opinion, because absence of conflict, there's still not peace. I mean, I could, as a married man, there are times where my wife and I are not on same perspective of things. And even though we may not be arguing with each other or anything like that, there is still something that is keeping us. So we have an absence of conflict, but we are not at peace because we have not dealt with the issue. And it's not until we deal with the issue that we come back to a place of harmonious relationship. And that is when, and especially in our house, that we experience shalom in that harmonious relationship. And same way with the going with the Father, with Adonai, we also need to make peace and be at shalom with him. And if there's something that's harboring it because of somebody else, then we need to make sure that there's nothing that can be accused against us, which we'll talk about more a little bit later. So moving on to 25 and 26, it says, if someone sues you, come to terms with him quickly. While you and he are on the way to court, or he may hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer of the court, and you may be thrown in jail. Yes, indeed, I tell you, you will certainly not get out until you have paid the last penny. And so I have as a kind of an intro commentary here, which is sort of on the Peshat level, the literal level on the top. Says, as believers, we have the Torah to guide us on how to walk upright. So again, as believers, we have the Torah to guide us on how to walk upright, that we should not be looking other places to other places for resolve. The courts are there for matters that are too hard to settle. But with a minimum of 3 judges, what they rule is binding. And once we get to court, the opportunity for mercy has passed. And so I want to show you a little bit of how the courts worked in, especially during Yeshua's time. And so there's a book called Sanhedrin. And some may know what Sanhedrin means. It's basically the judicial system that was set up during this time. And so, oh, this is going to be different. Shoot. Okay, yeah, so be able to still find it. I had a different reference in my notes. My notes were Sanhedrin 4:1, but it can also be found in 32a. So for those that aren't familiar, there's 2 different delineations of how the Sanhedrin or the Mishnah is broken up. And so some are basic, kind of like chapter and verse, and others are broken up into segments depending on how it's read, to put it that way. So in the Mishnah, Sanhedrin 32a, or in 4:1, it says both cases of monetary law and cases of capital law are equal with regard to the requirement for inquiry and interrogation of the witness. As it is stated, you shall have one manner of law in Leviticus 24:22. Meaning that all legal procedures must be uniform. And so this is the writings of the Second Temple time that they are establishing and explaining basically case law and how law is supposed to be handled within the court system. And so I mentioned that because now in 2 of 32a, it says, having stated the essential similarity between the two, referring to monetary and capital law, the Mishnah enumerates the differences between them. What are the differences between cases of monetary law and capital law? Cases of monetary law are judged by a court of 3 judges. And cases of capital law are judged by a court of 23 judges. In cases of monetary law, the court opens with deliberations, either with a claim to exempt the accused or with a claim to find him liable. Obviously, the plaintiff and the defendant, if you will. You have the DA versus the defender. And whoever starts the case, this is how the court opens. And in cases of capital law, the court opens with deliberations with a claim to acquit the accused, but it does not open with the deliberations to a claim to find him liable. So this is, again, just kind of sorting it out. So you have, in many cases, In the cities, you would have 3 judges that you would go to before a court. Our system today with 1 judge is not really found within Scripture. It was usually 3, and then the next court would be 23, and then you could go up to the full Sanhedrin, which was would be very significant cases, and that would be your 71. And the one being the high priest would be sitting in the one seat. And so the Sanhedrin then goes on and speaks a number of things about how court cases were handled, and how in the case of capital law, how it basically had to be unanimous in order to convict somebody, but in order to, in the cases of monetary, it was ruled by majority and so forth. And so there's a number of things throughout the Sanhedrin. It's a lot of case law, if you will. And so, but it's still interesting because this is the way that the Sanhedrin operated during the time of Messiah when he's speaking about these things. And so, Messiah here, in what he's telling us in 25, he's offering us some wisdom. But this wisdom can also have an allegorical interpretation. We can see that where in verse 25 it says, while you and he are on the way to court. The word or the phrase on the way should be something that should stimulate something that we say every week. And if you pray this prayer morning and night, it should be familiar. And it comes from the Shema. It's the 3rd verse of the Shema, actually. So starting in verse 4 is the Shema. And then it says we are to love the Lord our God with all of our hearts and soul. I'm sorry, it's going to be the 4th verse. I miscounted. And on the 7th one, it says, and you are to talk about them when you sit at home and when you are traveling on the road. So when you are on the way, you are to be speaking about God's commands, or speaking about the Torah along the way. Again, talking about, going back to where we were talking about with the righteous, when the righteous of the city prosper, the city rejoices. And so we are, as Tzaddiks, to live as a Tzaddik, we are to be walking and talking about Torah and living out Torah as we walk out, our daily lives, if you will, on the way, as we travel, and as we carry and conduct our business. But from a more spiritual perspective, this word accuser that is mentioned in Matthew chapter 5, in this translation, it doesn't use the word accuser, but in many of the others, the English, English Standard Version, ESV, and others, they mention here, instead of if someone sues you, come to terms, it can also be the accuser. And so this idea of accuser is kind of on the spiritual side. And so from this perspective, it is try to resolve any offenses that we have against God before the accuser, in this case Satan, can bring the case against you in the heavenly court. This is some rabbinic thought, but it's also can be found in Scripture. So if we go to Zechariah chapter 3, we see this very picture. Starting in verse 1, he showed me Yehoshua, or Joshua, the high priest, Kohen Hagadol, standing before the angel of Adonai, with the accuser, standing at his right to accuse him. Adonai said to the accuser, may Adonai rebuke you. accuser. Indeed, may Adonai, who has made Yerushalayim his choice, rebuke you. Isn't this man a burning stick snatched from the fire? And then it goes on and talks about Yehoshua. So here again, we have the accuser standing at his right. So in Jewish thought, the picture of the accuser is a little different than what you may have heard from a Christian background. The Jewish thought of the accuser, or Hasatan, or the Sultan, is sometimes how it's also caused. He has three roles on this earth. The three roles that he plays is, one is he plays the role of a tempter. Let's do 10 minutes, Abiel. He stands as a tempter to see if we will give in to temptations, but then he'll also serve as the prosecutor when we give in to temptations. There's also a third one, but we're not going to cover that per se today, but it has to do with the powers that he's given to sort of bring darkness to the world. But those two are pertinent to what we're talking about here in Matthew chapter 5. And so we can see here that in Zechariah, he stands at the right side within the court of God, and he is serving as the prosecutor, bringing the case against us. And who are his two witnesses? If we remember who the two witnesses are. Heaven and earth, which is what Moses told us in Deuteronomy chapter 30. He said, I call upon heaven and earth to be witnesses against you. And earlier, Messiah said that the Torah is not going to be done. The Torah will be upheld as long as heaven and earth exist, because if you don't have two witnesses, then there's no accusation that can be held accordingly. So Satan acts as the accuser, and he brings with him heaven and earth as witnesses against us before the court of God. And so basically, if we look at Matthew chapter 5 allegorically from a spiritual standpoint, we can see that even before, or as within the rabbinic writings, they say before Yom Kippur, which is the day of judgment, we spend the time before that repenting of anything that we may have done and overlooked over the past year, that we would be that as we seek atonement, that the accuser would no longer have anything to hold against us. So this matter, it can serve as wisdom for us on this earthly realm, but it also serves as wisdom within the spiritual realm, that we should, when we see that we have done something wrong, we are guilty of something, if we reconcile with Adonai beforehand, especially before the day of judgment, which is Yom Kippur. Also, we have the other great big J, capital J, if you will, day of judgment. The accuser will have nothing against us, because we will have reconciled the offenses that we have done. Because if we wait until that day of judgment, what's the warning? Well, you may be thrown in jail, and you will certainly not get out until you have paid every last penny. So to give you another picture, as I'm going to switch over, I'm going to read from Pirkei Avot. But again, one of the ways that I think of part of the role that Hasatan serves is he's kind of like, in some ways, like a detective. Think of a sting operation, where they are tempting somebody to, like within drug trafficking or something like that. They're trying to get somebody to sell drugs, or if it's intelligence, they're trying to get somebody to sell them intelligence, sex trafficking, all those different things, all those things. They're trying to get somebody to sell to them, tempting them. And then when they give in, they then serve to be prosecutors against them in that same way. And so Hasatan can only do with what he's given permission, no different than the investigator or the detective, who are, as these sting operations are able to operate within the parameters of the guidelines that are given to them by someone over them. Hasatan falls in that same category, which we see especially within the book of Job. Job gives us a clearer picture of that same idea. But in Pirkei Avot, which is Ethics of Our Fathers, if you're not familiar with what that is in Hebrew, and these were writings that were, again, around Messiah's time. Now I want to read from Pirkei Avot 4:11 as we finish up here on this second section of passages. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, to give you an idea, he was a first century rabbi. And so these are thoughts that are going on around the same time that Messiah was here. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is believed to be I'm trying to think of the word. It starts with a C. Anyways, he was around during the same time as Rabbi Akiva, and so Rabbi Akiva was there for the destruction of the temple, to give you an idea of a time frame. So he may have been a little bit after Yeshua's time or right around that time, but nonetheless, we can see how some of this stuff still ties together. To give you just, again, historically, that this is not necessarily new thought coming from Messiah. But he said, he who performs one commandment acquires for himself one advocate, and he who commits one transgression acquires for himself one accuser. Repentance and good deeds are a shield against punishment. So he's giving this picture of obedience, of walking upright as a Zadik in a picture of a court. Because he says if we perform the commandments of God and walk as a Zadik, we acquire, each time we do this, we acquire an advocate for us. And when we fail and we sin and haven't got that resolved yet, then we acquire for ourselves one accuser. Repentance and good deeds are a shield against punishment. Doesn't undo the thing that we did, but it does reconcile. We showed that we have reconciled through repentance and good deeds. And so it's a shield against punishment because we have taken care of that matter beforehand. Or another way to put it, our deeds that we do testify for or against us. Verse 27, we'll finish with this and probably pick it back up next time, because the next couple section is got a ton of Jewish references, if you will. So verse 27 says, you have heard that our fathers were told, do not commit adultery. We can see that this was certainly mentioned in Exodus. Let's see, what is Exodus chapter 20. Last week's Torah portion, because in the 10 statements, it is one of them. Verse 15 says, or 14 here, says, do not commit adultery. So what Messiah was saying was not necessarily new. If we look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, this ties into actually 28 and on. As I'm thinking about this, okay, so in verse 10 or 9, if you're in a Christian canonized Bible, it says, when you are in camp at war with your enemies, you are to guard yourself against anything bad. Or really, it says in the Hebrew there, to guard yourself against evil. And this goes into evil thoughts and protecting yourself, that we walk upright and we don't harbor inappropriate thoughts. And so it looks like I've combined my notes between 27 through 30 in Matthew chapter 5. So I guess we'll just see if we can knock those out real fast. So then he goes on after say, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that a man, whoever even looks at a woman with the purpose of lusting after her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you sin, gouge it out and throw it away. Better that you should lose one part of you than you have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand makes you sin, cut it off and throw it away. Better that you should lose one part of you than have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. And so, as we mentioned in 23, verse 10 of Deuteronomy, he mentions guard yourself against anything bad. The rabbis go on and say that's including to guard yourself of lusting after the women in when you're at war, and to guard your mind of anything else that may be going on. And this 23:10 also ties to something that's called avodah zarah. Avodah zarah is a book that is in the Talmud, sorry. And if we look at 20b, and it'll be verse 9, if you will. It says that the Gemara cites another source. Gemara is another book that interprets the verse cited above. The sages taught a teaching explaining the verse that we read in Deuteronomy 23:10. You shall keep yourself from every evil thing, which is immediately followed by the verse, if there be among you any man who is not ritually pure by reason of that which happened to him by night. This teaches that a person should not think impure thoughts by day and thereby come to the impurity of an emission by night. And so there's a book called Nida in the Mishnah called Nida, and it talks about all of the different things about Nida. And there's three references, 2:1, 13a, I should say three references, kind of overlap, 13a and 13b. And it talks a lot about having impure thoughts. And I debated about talking about them, but some of them can go a little bit further than I would want to certainly have on the screen. But it talks about, as I said, this is Jewish thought about harboring and protecting yourself against some of these thoughts of lust, as Messiah is talking about. And the whole point of why I'm bringing up these references is the same thing that Messiah is saying, that to be mindful of our thoughts, and to not even, to be careful that even looking at a woman, as it says in 28, looks at a woman with the purpose of lusting after her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And this cutting off and so forth is really hyperbolic. Even the sages go into a little bit of some darker things. If you do go into Nida, you'll see a little bit of some darker things that they mention about this subject. But it's all in hyperbolic to express the seriousness of the sin, because keep in mind, and we'll conclude with this idea, that on Yom Kippur, one of the things that was done on Yom Kippur, so you have the Erev Yom Kippur, and then the next day is the sacrifices of essentially three animals. You've got the goat, I should say, the bull for the priests, and then after the bull, you have the goat for Adonai, which is a sacrifice, an offering made in the temple to cleanse the temple. And then you have the goat known as the scapegoat, or the goat for Azazel, which is the one that's taken out of the camp and pushed off of a cliff during Second Temple times. But what I wanted to highlight here is the high priest, who is one time of the year, he goes into the Holy of Holies. They would say that they would have these young men come and be with him all night long and keep him awake all night long, lest he fall asleep and have even dreams of improper thoughts. Of course, they would be reviewing what he's supposed to be doing for the day, and the sacrifices, and how he's supposed to, carry things to make sure everything is in order, proper order. As this is, like I said, this is the big day. This is the biggest day for a high priest, because he gets to go into the Holy of Holies, bringing something to Adonai at that time. And so they would keep him up all night to prevent him from being unclean. And then we have a bigger problem. We don't have a high priest that can then perform the duties of high priest on Yom Kippur. And so this hyperbolic perspective here is not that you should literally gouge out your eye or cut off your hand if it causes you to sin, but instead to highlight the gravity of what, or this emphasize the seriousness of this sin.